Hey there, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar by the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. And today we're going to talk about providing inclusive services for LGBTQ plus survivors. All right, so in this presentation, we're going to cover a couple different things. So the first thing we're going to cover is understand the benefits of providing a space of inclusion. And there's a lot of elements to this. Secondly, we are going to cover, how to be able to identify these written, verbal, visual cues that kind of show that your organization, even the folks that are working for your organization, are a little bit more inclusive and have a little bit of that cultural competency that's definitely required to work with underserved and marginalized survivors. Third, we're going to talk about a little bit about personal biases. And this might come out when we're looking at different forms of inclusion, when we talk about adding sexual orientation, gender identity, pronouns to intake forms. And if you have any of those questions or any of those comments, there is a question box on your right-hand side that you should be able to type a little question in there, and I will be able to get that and answer that. Lastly, how to provide culturally competent referrals. And oftentimes this is something that we don't think about when we're providing inclusive spaces, is when we do have clients that we're serving, our organization may be inclusive. However, is the next organization that they go to inclusive? Are they culturally competent? Is this going to be a place that's safe or safer for that client, trying to limit and stop some of that re-victimization? So, first thing I want to know about you. Who are you? The poll should pop up on the screen. And just go ahead and answer that. You know, apparently I got a little excited. We're going to try that again. All right, well, we had a little bit of a technology fumble there. So it looks like we have a bunch of folks from different organizations who are on the webinar today, and hopefully our other polls will work a little better than that. Okay, so who are we? Who is the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition? So, UDVC, that's how I'll refer to it from now on. So we are the state coalition, the nonprofit coalition working to improve domestic violence services throughout the state of Utah. We support the domestic violence service providers within our state. We are a team. So there's a number of us who work for the coalition, but also we work with the community. We work with different domestic violence service providers throughout the state to find a way to represent not only the folks that we are serving, but also the domestic violence service providers and help give them a vote or a voice throughout the state. So we do a lot of different things. And one of the big things that we do are now these webinars and trainings throughout the state. So if you're lucky enough to get into one of those, I suggest you have fun there. All right, so the first part of this is we're going to cover the basics. If you were here for the last webinar, the cultural competency webinar, some of this was covered. However, we're going to roll over this a little bit to kind of give a backbone, kind of give some basis on what folks who are LGBTQ, what they are facing every day, and not just when they're trying to access services for maybe some victimization, some trauma that they've experienced within their life. So, transphobia. Transphobia, that's a big one right now. So this is often defined as the irrational fear of transgender folks, folks who do not conform to rigid gender stereotypes or sex roles. So a lot of folks tend to get hung up on that idea of fear, that idea of, I'm not afraid of transgender folks, I just don't want them near me, or I just don't want them teaching my children. So how does that translate into fear? So think about how community members, service providers, advocates, parents, kids, family members, how do we respond to fear? How do we respond to real and perceived fear? So some of our responses can range from avoidance, right? Avoiding the situation, maybe avoiding the topic. If it's talked about, we, try and change the subject, or we say, I don't know anything about that, or I don't want to talk about that. That can be a definite way that we're expressing that emotion, that fear, is to avoid. Think about controlling folks. Think about controlling the way people navigate social services, controlling bodies in public spaces. For example, those anti-trans bathroom laws. So think of how sometimes our feelings of fear, we respond by trying to control the situation. And unfortunately, in this case, we are, controlling transgender folks or folks who don't fit that norm or that standard, from accessing public services like the bathroom. So this can be greatly problematic when folks are trying to access services. So think for a moment, some of the maybe the news stories or some of the comments that you've heard from folks within your community or friends or family. Are the comments that they're making about transgender individuals, transgender folks, are they positive? Are they negative? Do they seem to be stemming from fear? How are these anti-trans bathroom laws? How are they depicted in the media? Is it seen as, oh, it's a safety issue, we have to protect folks from these scary transgender folks? So this can be greatly problematic. Even in states that don't have those anti-transgender bathroom laws, they are seeing increases in victimization and harassment and fear of transgender folks. All right, so homophobia and biphobia. So this is similar to the transphobia that we just talked about. So this is the irrational fear of, gay and lesbian folks, folks who don't fit that rigid standard for gender or sexuality. And remember, oftentimes we cover homophobia, but we don't cover biphobia. But biphobia is similar. So this is, the fear of that bisexuality, of folks who have multisexual orientations. So multi meaning more, so bisexual meaning two. So maybe being attracted to men and women, and so on. So some of these examples would be, that's so gay. And, those of us who have kids, maybe we've heard our kids say it, or when we go to our kids' schools, we would hear it in the hallways, right? And sometimes the students and the kids who are saying this, they don't actually know what they're saying or what it means, because this has become so ingrained in our language. It's part of our colloquial speech. It's our common vernacular. So sometimes kids don't even know what they're saying, right? If you ask folks, sometimes they'll say, "Oh, that's so stupid," right? but why do we say that's so gay, right? Why is gay seen as being something negative? Or why is gay synonymous, with being dumb or being stupid or being less than? So even this saying, it seems like, oh, that's just, kids. This is placing a value on folks. It's placing a value on folks' identities. And it does send a big message to the students in that school that being gay is less than, and it's not as accepted as other folks. Another example would be Orlando Pulse shooting. So this was a shooting that was motivated by homophobia and biphobia. All right, cisnormativity. Cisnormativity. So this is the belief that everyone is cisgender, and that anyone who isn't is either inferior or invalid. So cisgender, this would describe someone whose gender identity, so their sense of maleness, femaleness, multiple genders, or no gender, is congruent with their sex that was assigned at birth. And so remember, when we are assigned our sex at birth, our doctor generally looks at our genitalia, and if we meet the standard for a penis, then we are assigned male, and if we don't, then generally we're assigned female. So the majority of folks would identify as cisgender. However, we haven't really had a term for it because generally we come up with words, with adjectives, with words or descriptions, that describe things that are different from the norm. So some of you may not have heard of this term, and that could be a big reason why too. So a couple examples of cisnormativity. So I'm sure you've seen, maybe we've participated in these, the gender reveal parties. They're pretty prevalent on Instagram. I see a couple a day, generally when I'm on Instagram. And so one of the issues with gender reveal parties is that we're, again, assuming that because the child's genitalia looks a certain way, that they will identify a certain way, or that they will have a certain gender. Oftentimes I want to, tell folks, like, give it a couple years because you may be wrong, right? Next is depiction of transgender folks on TV. So notice how transgender folks are often depicted as, like, for example, Orange is the New Black. That's a great example of, we have a transgender inmate who, because they are transgender, they needed money, they needed certain things for maybe some transition related expenses. They, committed fraud or stole or done certain things. So that's problematic. Oftentimes transgender folks are depicted as being maybe emotionally stable or being depressed, or shown that that there's something, emotionally or mentally maybe unstable about them. Oftentimes they're going through some sort of hard struggle, right? There's few depictions of transgender folks that are positive, where the transgender person is, maybe, quote unquote, well adjusted or something. Generally, when they're depicting transgender folks, they often tend to focus on that transition or transition related themes, which can be problematic in many ways. Not only does it show, hey, transgender folks will always transition, which is not always the case. Transition is not necessarily a part of being transgender, but also it shows that, the struggles that are associated with that identity are intense, and could really instill maybe some fear and some anxiety in some youth or some folks that are struggling with gender identity. And then gender identifiers on social media. So what we're talking about here is when, like, example, Facebook, I think a couple of their social media platforms, added a bunch of different gender identity markers for their profiles. So instead of just having to choose between male and female, you now could choose, dozens of different identities, which is great, right? We know through the research that having language, having ways to describe, to connect, to find a community of folks that are like you is greatly beneficial. However, each of those gender identity markers on social media are examples of how that person is different from the norm. So we're kind of describing how that person doesn't kind of fit into what it means to be the norm, the standard. So that can be problematic, but we know that it can be also can be very beneficial. Gives people that language and that space to kind of connect with other folks. So heteronormativity. So this is the belief that everyone is heterosexual and that those who are not are inferior or less than. So a good example of this would be marriage equality, right? So marriage has, historically been defined as a white man marrying a white woman. Many laws or many states have had laws that specifically described marriage as being a union between one man and one woman. So these would all be examples of heteronormativity. So there's actually 4 parts to heteronormativity. And you'll kind of see how these 4 parts intermingle with our example of marriage equality. So the gender binary. So this is the idea, the belief that there is only male and female. And if you're not male, well, then you must be female, right? So this is the backbone, the foundation of heteronormativity. So attached to those binary genders are gender roles. So think for a moment how we would define masculinity, maleness in our communities, in our culture. Oftentimes we would define it as having short hair, as being the breadwinner, right? The one who provides for the family. Emotional, probably not, right? The emotions that men can socially exhibit are often anger and aggression, which is very limiting. It inhibits folks from getting their needs met, right? Think about experiencing an entire range of emotions, but only being able to display anger or aggressive behaviors. How are you going to get your needs met, right? Think of this navigation that masculine folks do every day. Is it safe to talk about this? Is it safe to express these emotions? Is it safe to feel these emotions, right? What about sex, right? Think of the male masculinity and sex, how men are supposed to be sexually available, sexually aggressive. Generally men don't say no when their partner wants to have sex. It's part of that being that dominant person. So now let's talk a little bit about femininity or the female, the feminine maybe roles that are out there. So maybe having long hair, right? What about the standard of beauty? It's different, right, than the male standard of beauty, right? What about sex? Women being the gatekeeper of that interaction. Women holding that gift of virginity, right? and finding someone to, bestow this gift upon them. And think about that constant navigation, that virgin whore dichotomy, where, women are constantly having to navigate this binary of, am I, innocent enough? Am I not experienced enough to kind of be desirable? But am I experienced enough to be desirable? Am I wearing clothes that are fitting for this situation? Think about being on a honeymoon with your partner. Think about going in for a job interview as opposed to getting a promotion, right? What about being on maybe a 10-year anniversary vacation with your partner? You'll probably be wearing a lot of sweatpants, right? So notice how, like, this dichotomy, this virgin whore dichotomy, and how women navigate sex on a daily basis. And now let's talk about emotions, right? So it's often assumed that women are driven by emotions, right? I don't know if I'm happy, sad, mad, angry. Do I like it? Do I hate it? I don't know. Will someone please tell me, right? So this idea that women are just full of emotions and have, issues doing other things, and you know, having to figure out how to separate emotions from, the things that they're doing can be difficult. Notice how the way women navigate emotions and the way men navigate sex, how they can be similar. And also how women navigate sex and how men navigate emotions, how those can kind of be similar, right? So the next part of heteronormativity are these relationship hierarchies. So when we talk about relationship hierarchies, what we're talking about are the types of relationships that are valued and devalued within our society, within our culture. So at the top of this hierarchy, the most valued identity would probably be the white, heterosexual, cisgender, legally married couple who is monogamous having reproductive sex. Now, why would we think that this, how do we know that this is the standard? How do we know that this is the most valued? Representation is a huge way to know who is valued and who is devalued within our culture, within our society. Think about the last time you saw engagement ads, right? When's the last time you saw an engagement ad where, a woman was, I got to get my husband, or I got to get my man the ring that he wants, right? When do we see couples of color? When do we see gay couples of color? When do we see, queer couples? And when do we see interracial couples, right? So think about what representation we're seeing. And oftentimes folks will say, well, we're starting to see more of them. But if we have a 1% increase in representation, that's not enough to represent that population, the people within our community, right? It's great that we're making strides, but it needs to be more. So relationship hierarchies. Another way for us to tell who is valued and devalued would be talking about the relationship type under that one, right? So let's talk about millennials for a second here. We all love talking about millennials. So we have a millennial couple. They're both white, heterosexual, cisgender, cohabitating millennial couple who is having non-reproductive sex. What are some of the things that they'll hear? What are some of the things that they'll experience, right? So sometimes folks, we'll hear, well, when are you going to give me grandkids, right? We may have all heard this. We may have even said it. But basically what this says is, here's the standard. Here's how you're not adhering to the standard. And here's how it's personally affecting me. And that's hard. No one wants to be the person who isn't meeting the standards of their family members or the people that they love and care about. So that could be that can be hurtful. And the people that hear that may become defensive. They may not want to talk about their relationship or the chance of having kids, and it may put a little bit of stress upon them. So the fourth part of heteronormativity is white supremacy. So how is white supremacy interlinked with all of this? So look at the gender roles we were talking about, right? Say you're working with a Native American man, right? Would probably have maybe long hair, right? Long hair, can be very important in Native communities. It's, connection to nature, it's strength, connection to family, to spirit. These are very powerful connections for folks. However, we base our gender roles, what is masculine, what is feminine, on white ideals of femininity and masculinity, and that can leave a lot of people out. Right? Additionally, think about relationship hierarchies. Think about representation of types of relationships. Right? What representation is out there? Who are the folks in the news? Who are the folks on TV? What does the representation look like? All right, so now we're going to move on to creating an inclusive space. So, what does inclusive mean? We have a fun little definition here for you from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. So, broad in orientation or scope, or covering or intended to cover all items, costs, and services. I think we can all pretty much agree. That seems like a pretty basic definition of inclusive. But what does that mean in terms of creating an inclusive environment for folks that you serve? All right, so now we are going to do another poll. Okay, so a poll should pop up on your screen, and go ahead and answer that. So my organization has LGBTQ plus themed or LGBTQ focused. We have brochures, posters, support groups, employee training, maybe stickers on the entrance. Got about 60% of folks voting. And, some folks may not have this in their organization, right? Another couple seconds here. All right. Okay. So this is the results that we got from that little poll there. It looks like 62% of you have LGBTQ inclusive brochures. 31% of you have LGBTQ inclusive posters. We have 23% with support groups and 92% with employee training and 23% with stickers on the entrance. So this is going to be interesting to see how those numbers change, after this training. Maybe there's some information that you didn't know about. Maybe there's some ways that you didn't know you could convey that element of inclusion before. All right, so let's get this. There we go. So, visual cues. So this would be like the stickers in our poll, posters, can even be brochures, right? So here's a couple examples. So these are pretty basic examples. These you could find just through Google. Certain organizations will give out stickers after you've completed like a safe zone training or a cultural competency training, which can be really great to get those posted on either your office, maybe your office door, on the entrance of your actual organization. So both can be greatly beneficial. I've seen several organizations do this differently. Some have stickers on the front entrance door. Some have stickers on the entrance, and they have maybe stickers or signs on office doors. That's really great. So think about your organization may be inclusive in general. However, maybe some of your employees or advocates or volunteers maybe haven't gone through the training. So it could be really beneficial to have folks who have specifically gone through LGBTQ inclusive training, cultural competency training, to list that on their office doors or somewhere within their office. Let's see, now we're going to give you kind of some more examples of, these are posters. I've seen some of these on shirts, kind of different ways to show a little bit, you know, hey, we're inclusive, or we've had some cultural competency training. If you come here, we're gonna understand you a little bit more, and we're gonna be able to serve you better. Let's see if we can get this. There we go. All right, so in this one, so notice they're using that rainbow kind of template. Together we can end domestic violence. So this kind of shows you visually that LGBTQ folks may be the focus here, right? Or even like diversity could be a focus here. So this one seems like it was used specifically for maybe a gay men support group, maybe a pride event, you know, maybe some other event. So it seems pretty basic, right? So this image, it happens to us too, you know, with the broken heart and, you know, maybe the rainbow tear, you know, was used in like an LGBTQ resource center, kind of, you know, bringing to light, oh, so this can actually happen. Domestic violence, intimate partner violence can happen within our community. So here is a couple. Here are a couple posters, and in a second we'll have a expanded one. But notice we have different faces. We have different identities highlighted. You know, anyone can suffer from domestic violence. And it's really important too that if you do have visual cues, if you are saying that you're inclusive, that you actually do stand by these practices. So, for example, this anyone can suffer from domestic violence. If you are saying that within maybe presentations, PowerPoints, other events, that your entire presentation or PowerPoint, your operations, they're mirroring that idea, and that we're not just saying it, that we're actually doing it, because that's a huge part of this. It's easy to print off rainbow stickers online. However, are we actually putting it into practice? So this one, voices unheard, LGBT domestic abuse and gender-based violence. So this one, it looks like, was from Scotland. And the majority of these I did get overseas. So they weren't in the United States. They were mostly from the UK and Europe. So here's one of the ones we just saw, kind of blown up, right? So there's no pride in domestic violence. If you were at Pride last year, and if you're coming to Utah Pride this year, the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition has shirts that are similar to this. All right, so there's no pride in domestic abuse. So notice how this theme of pride is often used. Pride has been used to change the way LGBTQ folks not only think about themselves, but how the community in itself has kind of been seen. Is that it's not something to be ashamed of. It's something to be happy about, and kind of finding pride in that marginalized or that underserved, devalued identity. So notice how there's a couple different faces here, right? And in this one, seems pretty basic, right? So lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans, domestic violence, a different closet, right? And it also has a different message: love is not supposed to hurt, right? And this is a very interesting one, because it does talk about that element of being in the closet. Someone could be in the closet for their sexual orientation or gender identity as it is, and then how does that person reach out when they're in a domestic violence situation? It's almost like a closet within a closet, right? And so that in itself is another barrier to service that we see. So verbal cues. So what you say. So here's a couple examples. So verbal. So using they, them, their pronouns. Most of us have probably heard of these, maybe in the news, maybe on social media, maybe someone who uses they, them, their pronouns. I myself do use they, them, their pronouns. And so this can be part of, intake. It can be part of the, sitting down with an advocate or sitting down with a caseworker, a case manager. Think about how you introduce yourself to someone, a new client that you're seeing, right? You're like, oh, hi, hello, my name is Andy. I use they, them, their pronouns. What would you like me to call you, and what pronouns do you use? Right? Super easy. And think about having, someone who is transgender, or someone who is, genderqueer, gender nonconforming, and they're coming into a service provider. They're already maybe a little bit emotional, maybe unsure if this place is safe. Can we trust the folks? Are they going to keep my identity confidential? Are they going to help me? And even just asking this question, what gender pronouns do you use, can be a way to drop one of those barriers really quickly. And remember, when you do ask this, not to say what gender pronouns do you prefer. Generally, we like to ask is what gender pronouns do you use, rather than prefer. When we say prefer, what we're saying is that, well, what pronouns do you prefer, but it's only a preference, so I can still continue to use pronouns, which can be problematic. Misgendering transgender folks is often an abuse tactic that's used against trans folks, gender nonconforming folks. It's also, has historically been used to hurt and invalidate folks. So to make sure that, if we, do ask this question, that we are going to make sure to use the pronouns that person does share with us that they use. Additionally, mirror language. So remember, it's not our jobs as advocates, it's not our jobs as service providers, it's not our jobs as case managers to correct anyone on their identity or their lived experience. They know their identity better than we do. They know their experience better than we do. They are an expert in their life. So we need to make sure that we are mirroring that language. So if someone comes in and they say, I'm bisexual, I use he, him pronouns, that we make sure to use those he, him pronouns. And we also make sure that that we're not saying, oh, using the word gay instead of bisexual, because the lived experience of bisexual folks and folks who are gay are greatly different. Bisexual folks are a marginalized identity within a marginalized community. So making sure that we are mirroring their language, because we want them to also know, to also understand that we are listening, right? And we are there for them. We are providing a service, and we want to make it as inclusive as possible. Also, using the word partner, or, if you're asking about maybe in a domestic violence situation, don't assume that the partner is a certain gender or a certain identity, because we never know. And if we start off a conversation with, so what did your boyfriend do to you? That right there throws up a barrier. So that person will now have to come out before even sharing their story. And that could be really difficult, especially when you are seeking services, like maybe you've been in a crisis situation or a domestic violence situation. So we want to make sure to limit those barriers. All right, written cues. So this is going to be the biggest section of this. There's a lot to go over. Written cues can be a great resource, right? So part of these written cues is making sure that employees and clients understand that this organization, strives to be bias free, right? So, for example, in your employee manual, does your employee manual specify that folks have to dress a certain way, that they have to, if they're female, if they have to wear dresses, or if they're male, they have to wear slacks? Does it include a non-discrimination policy that is inclusive of LGBTQ folks? Is it written in the patient's rights or the client's rights statements or agreement? And what about orientation forms? Think about even your program, the programs that you offer within your organizations. Do you have a healthy relationships class that asks women to describe their perfect husband or perfect boyfriend, right? So that would be problematic. That could leave out a lot of the folks that are accessing that programming. So to make sure that we're not limiting things in our writing. So a great way is within the behavior contract. A lot of domestic violence service providers, a lot of organizations that serve folks experiencing homelessness, for example, may have behavior contracts, right? That these are acceptable behaviors and so on while staying here. So you can include it in your behavior contract, or you can have it as separate form to be signed. But here's some wording that you can use. I can also get you some other wording. We can go over some of your policies to kind of see how we can make them a little bit more inclusive. Additionally, but for example, this one says, I understand that this agency serves all types of people and strives to create an environment where people feel safe from bias. I understand and agree that staff and our other clients may respectfully challenge me on any statements I make that may be perceived as bias against a stereotype about a group of people. If I feel biased statement has been made, I understand I have the right to seek staff assistance to address the remarks. So this could be really important. You know, it almost, gives people that permission to be able to stand up for themselves, to be able to advocate for themselves, and additionally, be able to seek support when they do feel that they have been wronged. Intake forms. Intake forms oftentimes are the first thing that folks, read through when they go into your organization. Intake forms can be a great way to convey that element of inclusivity. Think about the last time you went to the doctor. Are there spaces for gender identity or sexual orientation? Usually not, right? I've never seen one. And that could be really beneficial when you're going to the doctor for folks to know your gender identity, sexual orientation. Think about, safer sex, healthy sexuality practices, things, that are geared towards, you that might pertain more to you and not just folks in general. So that can be greatly beneficial. And think about being in a domestic violence service, provider, that having this information can be greatly beneficial to understand, hey, there are more barriers that this person might be facing. Here are some additional resources that I can have ready or that I could collect to be able to give out to this person, right? So for example, writing what is your gender with a blank rather than gender male female or sex male female, right? How would you describe your sexual orientation, right? Some folks worry that people will write in random things or things that don't make sense, but in actuality, that's pretty rare. In my work, I have never seen anyone write anything in that wasn't a sexual orientation that you would generally see. So I will include a list of identities to kind of give you a little bit more information if you're maybe a little bit confused on that. Or you can even write it as, how would you describe yourself, right? How would you describe your gender identity? How would you describe your sexual orientation? Kind of giving folks the ability to describe in their own words how they identify can be greatly beneficial. All right, so now we are going to look at how to make forms inclusive. So we're going to kind of break this down here for a minute. So here is a not so good example of inclusion. All right, so this is your gender section on your intake forms. So we have a couple issues here. First, we have this male and female body or female and male body, right? So oftentimes this is used as a simplistic way to describe the transgender experience. Unfortunately, it does end up hurting and invalidating trans folks. It kind of says, hey, there's something inherently wrong or inherently defective about you, as opposed to someone who is transgender, it being, a variation of the human experience, right? So there's nothing inherently wrong with folks who are transgender, and this, kind of assumes that there is something wrong. All right, this next one, male by surgery or female by surgery, right? So this is greatly problematic because this says that your identity, your transgender identity isn't, a core or inherent part of you, that it's actually, something that's been, simulated, that it was created, that it's not necessarily real. And, understand that transgender folks, most often every day of their life are constantly trying to prove and to show why their identity is valued, or excuse me, valid, um, and trying to prove like their authenticity, right? So think about that element of authenticity, right? So a person who is transgender, identifies as transgender, that person is authentic in their identity, completely authentic, right? However, when we say you are male by surgery, we're saying that you are actually something else, but you have changed something about yourself to be something different. So this is greatly problematic. And the surgeries and medical interventions that you've had are generally no one's business, right? Oftentimes you don't need to know, what surgeries or, maybe what procedures folks have had to effectively advocate for them, right? All right, so this last little bit here, this male today, female today, male till noon, female till noon. So, sometimes, it's included in an attempt to, be inclusive of gender fluid folks. However, oftentimes it's used to kind of poke fun or to, trivialize, I can't even say that, trivialize the idea of having a non-cisgender identity, right? So this is similar to that notion, that idea, that bisexual folks, why can't they just choose? Why can't they kind of decide? Why are they confused? When in actuality, folks who are bisexual and folks who are transgender are not, necessarily confused, right? Confusion can be a part of identity development. However, someone who identifies as transgender, confusion is not a part of that. So here's a better example of inclusion. So notice here at the top that it says check one or more options, right? So this could be great. That person can more accurately describe their identity. What if they identify as a transgender woman, right? Or maybe they just identify as woman. That is great because the complexities of gender and gender identity may not be conveyed on your current intake forms. So this last section right here, this other piece. So oftentimes, like organizations will have an other section. We've seen it on testing throughout our years going through the school system. But having other as an option for like gender identity or sexual orientation can be greatly problematic. So we have to remember that these identities have been marginalized, these identities have been devalued, and when we list other, or we have an option for other, remember that these folks have been the other for most of their life, for even their entire life. So to make sure that we are not othering them when they come into our organizations is really important. So the best practice would be to get rid of that other. And so just leave it blank and let folks write their identity in. So a couple slides ago, we talked about having a question, how do you describe your gender identity, with a blank. That can be a perfect way to do it. Some organizations may want to do it this way, depending on their reporting requirements, depending on grant requirements. And that could be up to you and your organization, which works better for you. But remember that even though we are trying to grab the statistics and get numbers for the folks that we see for reporting and for grants, that we need to remember that we can still be inclusive and culturally competent and limit folks being re-triggered and re-victimized. So referrals. So referrals are really important when we're working with marginalized identities. Our organization may not be as culturally competent as we'd love to be, or maybe we don't offer the services that person needs, right? So what I would like to know right now is, where do you refer your LGBTQ clients? And that should pull up on screen for you, and just go ahead and answer that. Where do you refer your LGBTQ clients? I just got about 50% folks voted. About 70% of folks voted. We'll give you a couple more seconds. All right, couple. All right. So let's share this with y'all. I'm actually not surprised by these numbers. The majority of folks are referred to the Pride Center, which could be great. The Pride Center has a lot of programming, you know, especially for like youth and stuff. However, the Pride Center doesn't generally work with folks who've experienced domestic or sexual violence. I see that we had equal numbers for the Pride Center and the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition, and that's probably because of the job that I do. Oftentimes, I do interact with folks that have been referred to UDVC. You know, I do referrals, and I do that cultural competency piece for places. So the LGBTQ Affirming Therapist Guild of Utah, a lot of folks actually don't know about this organization. And this is a great organization that has a literal list of affirming therapists within Utah. So this can be a great resource for your organization when you are in need for someone who is culturally competent, for a survivor or someone who is LGBTQ. Other organizations, you know, referring folks to organizations that work with folks from maybe their culture, right? Like PICTAR, like Pacific Islander folks, Centro de la Familia, you know, like, you know, sometimes some of these organizations, some of these referrals, we want to refer folks to organizations that we feel they may, you know, benefit from, because they may share an identity with some folks. But a lot of, you know, organizations don't have that LGBTQ piece to them, and so that can be kind of difficult when you're trying to make a referral to an organization to serve an LGBTQ client, but they may not have programming or even cultural competency, but they do serve a certain aspect of that person is identity. And I see other or none. So yeah, thank you all for participating in that poll. So we're going to break this down. I have 10 basic steps, I guess, to finding a affirming referral. And this will be available in your handout section. If you can see that on your screen, I've included 3 different handouts. We have providing inclusive services, which kind of goes over what we've covered today. We have the affirming referrals part, which is the section we're going to now. And then I have a basic working with LGBTQ survivors. Okay, so the number one thing, is when you are creating a list of referrals for LGBTQ folks. It's really important that we are creating a list ahead of time rather than calling around trying to find resources for a client that we're working with currently. One of the issues with calling around as you're working with a client is asking about LGBTQ inclusivity can actually out that client to that organization. And, that's not something that we want to do as part of offering confidential services. And, making sure that that survivor, that client is a part of the decisions and a part of their information sharing is greatly important. So when you're creating referral lists for LGBTQ folks, you want to start by asking general questions about the services that that organization offers. So, for example, if you call one of the domestic violence service providers here in Utah, say you call South Valley Services, and you're asking, okay, so, what kind of services do you offer, right? Even though they may be an organization that primarily works with domestic violence and sexual violence survivors, they may have a bunch of different resources that can be greatly beneficial, including healthy relationship classes, support groups, right? And think about when you ask about support groups that you're asking more questions. So if a organization offers a support group, it's like, oh great, so you have a support group Mondays and Wednesdays and Fridays. Who is able to attend those support groups, right? Is it a women's only support group? Do they offer any support groups for folks of color? Do they have any support groups for LGBTQ folks? And if they don't have support groups specifically for marginalized and underserved groups, ask more questions, right? So, okay, you don't have a specific support group for marginalized identities, for underserved identities. Has your facilitator gone through any cultural competency training? Are they able to effectively handle LGBTQ issues? Are they effectively able to, talk about issues of white supremacy? Right? Are they able to provide a support group to provide programming that is inclusive and breaks down as many barriers as possible? So probe for more information. What specifically do you offer for LGBTQ folks? Have you worked with LGBTQ folks before? If you have, how culturally competent is your staff? Right? Have they gone through cultural competency training? And if so, how long ago was it? How long was the training? Right? For example, the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition offers several different trainings specific for LGBTQ folks. We have trainings that range from an hour to 8-hour day-long trainings. So what has your staff been trained on, right? And have they specifically been trained on working with LGBTQ survivors of trauma, right? Next. So ask if there's been any incidents or any issues that LGBTQ clients have had while trying to access those services. And, this may be a difficult question to get that answer from. A lot of organizations don't want to be like, actually, 2 weeks ago we had a lesbian couple that we had to remove, from services and right? So no one wants to actually admit that. So this could be really difficult to get that information. And make sure that, you know, you're communicating with that other service provider, that you are trying to find resources for your future clients that are affirming, and that even information of things that are potentially negative can be really good to know when sending, you know, folks to that service provider. So ask questions about how these, you know, homophobic, biphobic, you know, transphobic comments, behaviors, how they're handled. So if, you know, someone in your like behavior contracts, you know, in domestic violence service providers, you know, that clients, when they sign, you know, no violent behavior is often listed within these client contracts, or no verbally aggressive behavior, right? However, if someone comes up and says, you shouldn't be here, you know, you tranny, is that aggressive? Is that behavior aggressive because their voice wasn't elevated, right? But what they were saying was very aggressive. So is this going to be handled in the same way that you know, a yelling match or something might be handled? Is this going to be handled in an efficient and an effective way? Are all staff trained on how to handle these situations, right? Even if there isn't an out or an open LGBTQ person within that organization, that shelter, even addressing the comments that are said in passing. You know, do you have anytime a client says, oh, that's so gay, like I don't want to go to that healthy relationships class, right? Are we addressing that behavior? Are we addressing that speech? That's greatly problematic, right? Not necessarily behaviors and comments that are directed towards folks in the LGBTQ community, but what are you doing in general when any of these comments are being said? Confidentiality. Very, very important, especially when we're working with survivors of trauma. You know, is the organization that you're speaking with, what are their confidentiality policies and practices? Do they get VAWA funding? Do they get Violence Against Women Act funding? If they do, then their confidentiality practices are going to be pretty tight. But not everyone who you're going to refer folks and clients to are going to adhere to you know, strict rules of confidentiality like VAWA. So what does your policies and you know, procedures and practices, what do they look like surrounding confidentiality, specifically also with LGBTQ folks? When you are discharging a patient or a client, or you know, exiting a patient, or even referring them to another organization, is this information going to be shared? For example, are you going to share your intake form with another organization, right? And if they don't adhere to VAWA confidentiality, do they do releases of information? And if they do release of information, what does their release of information look like? Is it a global release? Or is it a organization or person specific release? Very good information to have and to know. All right, so next. So this is a question I often get within trainings as technical assistance calls. How do we work? How do we house? How do we work with clients who are transgender, who identify as transgender? So best practice would be to allow that client, that survivor, to choose where they feel comfortable staying, being housed, and the support groups and services that they would like to go to. So when you ask an agency, when you have, when a transgender person comes in, how are they housed? What services are available to them? Are they put in, regular housing, or are they put in a separate housing? I've seen some organizations that have an area or a place specific for transgender folks, which could be, it could be beneficial in the way that trans folks can kind of find support within each other and, maybe feel a little safer with that community. However, exclusion does not equal safety. Oftentimes, we feel like maybe we have to keep men and women separate from each other in our shelters or in our organizations. We feel like we may have to keep transgender folks in, a different section to, quote unquote, increase their safety. But in reality, exclusion does not increase safety. So basically what we're saying is that if this person stays with their quote unquote kind, then they won't have any issues, right? And that's problematic. We don't want to segregate folks. If an agency that does, accept LGBTQ clients does segregate transgender clients from their general clients, that can be really problematic. And that's really something important that you would like to know, and that you would like to be able to pass on to your client if that information is, if your client needs and wants to know that information. All right, so housing. So we kind of talked a little bit about this. So if the agency does provide any type of housing or shelter, it could be greatly beneficial to understand how that is set up, how clients get into that, and so on. So if you are reaching out to a domestic violence service provider, and you're asking about their housing and how their shelter is set up, and they say, oh, we don't have a shelter for male survivors, and maybe you're working with a transgender male survivor, that could be greatly problematic, because if we house a transgender person in a hotel, the security is going to be very different than at a domestic violence shelter. If that person is found out at that hotel or motel, that their confidentiality, their safety can be greatly compromised. So that can be problematic. Also, if the domestic violence service provider, they say, oh, we don't serve men, or we don't shelter men here, but they accept transgender men because they're quote unquote really women, then that can be greatly problematic. Not only are we invalidating that person's identity and lived experience, but also we're assuming that it would be okay and that person would feel good being in a setting, a women-only setting. So that can be greatly problematic too. So it's really good to understand how their housing and shelter is set up, so you know what to expect, right? It's always great to know what to expect and kind of have that information, especially when you're, potentially going to work with folks and clients that could be in a crisis situation, right? And have a large number of referrals and information to help not only calm their nerves, but also even help you, feel better about referring that person to another organization. All right, so here's a little bit of a review of what we've covered. So we talked about visual cues. So we talked about having posters, having pictures, having brochures available and visible for clients around your shelter. Let's talk a little bit about brochures. So when you have brochures, the UDVC does offer LGBTQ specific brochures. We have a bunch of different kind. We also have them digitally, which is great. If you do have brochures and you are including LGBTQ brochures, or maybe you already have LGBTQ brochures, make sure that they are with all the other brochures. Don't separate or segregate those brochures. That is could be a big visual cue that, hey, I'm different from everyone else. I have to go to a different part of the shelter or the organization or a different table to find information that relates to me. Also, this can potentially out that person if they have to go to a specific place, even if it's on a separate table, to get information that is relevant to them. So make sure that we are putting all this information together in a centralized location rather than separating it by identity or separating it by group. And that is also important for brochures and information for male survivors of domestic and sexual violence. So stickers. Stickers are easy to obtain. You can order them online. UDVC has a couple options that I have that I can, give out after we've gone through some cultural competency training. But there are so many different resources. There are so many different versions of stickers that it's best, for you to look and find out one that works specifically with you. I've seen some organizations where they don't have stickers or signs on their doors, on their entrance doors, but all of their employees have a little rainbow or some sort of inclusive marker on their name tags. So that can be great, right? Because each advocate or each person in that organization says right on their name tag, which everyone will wear their name tag every time they're at work or in that organization. So that clearly shows, okay, inclusivity, right? It also, unfortunately, it may not be safe to put rainbow stickers or inclusive sticker signage on your door. Unfortunately, hate motivated crimes and bias motivated crimes against LGBTQ folks are unfortunately all too common. So it's really important for you to assess your situation and make sure that is safe for your organization. And you may not put it on the entrance door, but putting it on maybe the intake desk or something will work better for your organization. So it still says, hey, we're affirming, hey, we're inclusive, but also limits your organization or specifically like your shelter from being targeted by anti-LGBTQ violence. Verbal cues. So are we mirroring language? Are we using language that is inviting? Think about, unfortunately, we've heard like the term like politically correct, right? Oftentimes now folks equate this term to being censored or told that you can't say or can't do anything, right? We do need to remember that being censored and consequences are two different things. So if you say something that's offensive, you call, folks homos, and people are upset about that, that is called a consequence. That is not being censored. So I want you to think of politically correct. I want you to think of it like this. Using language that brings everyone to the table. Using language that brings everyone to the conversation. Because that's what we want to do, is we want to create places where people feel safer, they feel welcome, they feel like they can get services and that their needs can be met. And remember, you are going to make mistakes. I make mistakes. And this is literally my job, right? So the years of education, the years of experience, even my years of lived experience, I'm still human. I still do make mistakes. Remember that you all will make mistakes, and it's okay to make a mistake. It happens. The big issue is what you do after you make that mistake. The easiest way to do this is apologize and move on, right? Apologize, correct yourself, move on. So for example, if you are working with a transgender client, they use they them pronouns, and while you are talking to another advocate or another employee, you say, oh, he's going to go to your support group. So instead of just ignoring what just happened, say, excuse me, they are going to go to your support group, right? So kind of like, oop, I made a mistake. You correct it, you move on. A lot of times folks will, like, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do that. I've been trying so hard. It's really hard. I'm having a hard time with this. And just kind of like try to, persuade that other person that they're trying and that their intentions were good. But remember that intention doesn't equal impact. And some of the, things that were done with the best intentions resulted in some of, the most terrible things. So remember that intent does not equal impact, right? All right, so last on verbal cues, is biased language being addressed? Making sure that if we do hear it, that we're addressing it, right? So in passing, even when you're within meetings with clients, and they, say, oh, well, I don't want to be with the housed with the dyke, right? That, okay, let's break that down. Let's talk about it. Why do you feel that way? It could be that client doesn't understand LGBTQ folks. Maybe they are experiencing a lot of stress. Like, how can we get this solved? How can we also create an educational moment for this client, right? Written cues, intake forms, policies. Think about your non-discrimination policies at the organizations that you work for now. Do they list sexual orientation and gender identity? So oftentimes I see non-discrimination policies that will say, this organization does not discriminate based on all of the statuses listed in the federal non-discrimination, right? That is actually problematic because sexual orientation and gender identity aren't included in that. So we need to make sure that we are including those two things. All right, and then referrals. Make sure beforehand that we are finding out if those referrals are culturally competent. We're finding out if those referrals are going to be affirming, if they're going to be beneficial for the person that we are, referring. The last thing we want to do as service providers, especially domestic violence and sexual assault service providers, the last thing we want to do is to send one of our clients one of our survivors to a place where they will be re-victimized. It's the last thing we want to do. So we want to make sure that we're sending them, that we feel confident that our handoff will allow them to continue in their journey of healing. All right. So here's a couple resources. So in the state of Utah, so domestic violence victim services. So we have 15. Reading is hard right now, I guess. 15 in the state of Utah, and they are available 24 hours a day and 7 days a week. We have a slew of different services that are available throughout the state. A lot of the domestic violence service providers are dual providers, so they are a dual sexual assault provider and a domestic violence service provider, which is greatly beneficial. So when you're doing your referrals, make sure to talk about that. Ask about the services that they offer to survivors of trauma. So here is the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition's link line. This is a 24/7 crisis line, right? You can call for, crisis intervention, safety planning, information. You can even call for referrals. So the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition has access to, statewide referrals and statewide resources. So this is a great resource for you to call. And remember, if you do have questions or you feel like your survivor or the person that you work with may benefit from calling the link line or just talking to someone on some resources that are available throughout the state, or maybe their specific situation, absolutely give us a call. And you as a service provider can call to get information and resources as well. You can also visit us online at www.udvc.org. And my information is up there. We have our training offerings. We have a whole bunch of different cool stuff, webinar information, and so on. So here is my information. You are more than welcome to get a hold of me. My phone number is 801-521-5544, and my extension is 106. But if you don't know the extension, listen to the instructions on the automated phone system, and you could reach me by hitting the training or education number. You can email me at my email address. That's the easiest way to get a hold of me. Oftentimes I'm out doing training, so I'm not available at my office line, but you can leave me a message. But email me. If you have any questions, comments, you need any technical assistance, anything else, I am available for that. All right, so thank you everyone for attending this webinar. Hopefully we'll see you back in the upcoming webinars. On the 5th of next month, we will be covering Domestic Violence 101. So that's a pretty great webinar, pretty great presentation. There's a lot of stuff that, folks think that they know about the basics of domestic violence, but are unsure, or there's a lot of other things that they may not have thought about it before. So hope to see you there. I'm going to stay on for a couple more minutes. If anyone has any questions, you can ask me here in the question box. Thank you, and I hope you have an excellent day. Hmm. I know a lot of folks have questions on the anti-trans bathroom stuff.